The room was silent, but not just any silence. It was dense, thick with tension, as if the very air was holding its breath. In the center, standing before the podium, a man with a face hardened by years and war awaited his turn to speak. He wore his veteran's uniform with pride, although the passage of time and the invisible scars of the past weighed more than any medal on his chest. His name was Martin Salcedo, 48 years old, with the gait of someone who has walked more in his soul than with his feet. He had served in high-risk missions, survived ambushes, explosions, and the silence of the barracks upon returning from the front. But no battle had prepared him for this day. Beside him, a young woman, Elena, a social worker, firmly held an empty leash. That absence said it all. His dog Rocco was not there. Detained by court order, he awaited in a military facility, far from the one he considered his life partner. Martin had not come to fight for property or a benefit. He only wanted something that was not in the legal manuals, to say goodbye to his dog. But before him stood Judge Ramirez, famous for her harshness and lack of empathy, who did not seem to understand the emotional dimension of the request. What no one expected was that this trial, which seemed routine, would end up touching the hearts of everyone present. This story is not just about laws, but about humanity. Stay until the end. I promise you that what happens in this room will change the way you see justice and true love. Subscribe and follow this story to the last heartbeat. Martin adjusted his uniform jacket as he crossed the threshold of the court. It was not the first time he had faced a hostile environment, but this time he wore no helmet or vest. The only thing protecting his interior was his memories. With each step, the empty leash in Elena's hands seemed to weigh more than any backpack on campaign. The courtroom was packed, officials, journalists, onlookers. Despite not being a media case, something in the story had caught their attention. Perhaps the contrast between the figure of the decorated ex-soldier and the coldness of the legal process. Perhaps the humanity of such a simple request. Judge Ramirez was already seated on the bench, reviewing papers with a frown. Her reputation preceded her, severe, impassive, immune to emotions. She was known for her adherence to the rules and for rejecting anything that smelled of sentimentality. "Mr. Salcedo," she said in a firm voice, "do you confirm that your request is to have a final meeting with the animal identified as Rocco, currently in the custody of the army?" Martin cleared his throat. His voice, although firm, trembled at the edges. "Yes, Your Honor. I just want to say goodbye to him. I'm not asking for him back. I just want to see him one last time." The judge narrowed her eyes. "And why do you think this court should dedicate resources to an emotional situation? We don't judge feelings here, Mr. Salcedo, but facts." The murmur among those present was immediate. Eleanor touched his arm gently, as if reminding him to remain calm. Martin took a deep breath. "Because that dog saved my life more than once, in combat and afterwards. He's not just a dog, Your Honor. He's the only family I have left." The judge was silent for a moment. Then she looked at the prosecutor, Mr. Gutierrez, who was already preparing to speak. With his dark suit and calculating gaze, he embodied the spirit of the system, correct, efficient, but without a human face. "The public ministry considers this request inadmissible," he said bluntly. "The animal in question is the property of the state. There is no legal basis to allow this type of meeting. Opening an exception would set a dangerous precedent." Martin closed his eyes for a moment. It was not the first time he felt that everything was against him, but this time it hurt differently. Not out of fear, but out of powerlessness. He could not fight against a wall made of papers and rules. The judge nodded slowly, as if everything had already been decided before beginning. "The court will take note of the arguments, but I want something understood from the beginning. This case is not about sentimentality. It's about what is legal and what is not." Martin lowered his gaze, but something inside him refused to give up. As the prosecutor began to present the formal background of the case, Martin's eyes were lost in a memory, the first time he saw Rocco. It was at a dusty military base, under the scorching sun. A restless puppy, but with attentive eyes. Since then, they had never separated. "Are you all right, Mr. Salcedo? asked the judge, noticing his disconnect. Martin looked up, swallowing. Sorry. I was just remembering. A slight murmur of understanding crossed the room. It did not come from the judge or the prosecutor, but from the anonymous faces in the benches. People who, perhaps, also knew what it was to love unconditionally. The judge tapped the table gently with her gavel. Let's proceed, time is limited. The clock on the wall read 10:14. It had barely begun, and Martin already felt that every second was slipping away like sand through his fingers. But all was not yet lost, not while he had a voice to tell his story. The prosecutor, Gutierrez, rose with controlled elegance, as if each of his movements had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. He had a reputation for being implacable and meticulous, someone who saw the world in black and white. For him, the law should not adapt to human emotions, but protect itself from them. Your Honor, he began, Mr. Salcedo served with honor. No one denies it. But this court is not here to pay tribute. We are here to determine whether an exception that the law does not contemplate is appropriate. And the answer is no. Martin clenched his fists on his knees. It was not hatred he felt towards Gutierrez, but a mixture of incomprehension and frustration. How could someone speak so coldly of something so essential? The animal to which he refers, the prosecutor continued, was trained with state resources, assigned to specific tasks, and after his retirement has been relocated in accordance with current protocol. There is nothing more to discuss. The judge nodded slowly, but did not intervene. Her face remained imperturbable, like a statue carved in marble. It was then that Martin remembered. Not a simple memory, but a wound still open. Years ago, in a remote area of international mission, a patrol was trapped in hostile territory. There were hidden mines, and the fog made it impossible to distinguish the danger. Martin, in command, ordered them to stop. It was at that moment when Rocco, still young but already trained, lunged forward, sniffing the air with tension. He stopped abruptly, barking loudly. One more step, and the entire squad would have blown to pieces. That dog, Martin whispered softly, saved my life that day, and many others. Elena looked at him with concern. She knew the trial was important, but also that reliving those memories had a high emotional cost. The prosecutor noticed the reaction and used it to his advantage. Your Honor, I understand that Mr. Salcedo may have a sentimental attachment to the animal, but we are talking about state property. If we allow these types of farewells, tomorrow any soldier will be able to request the same. What will happen then? Are we going to turn the courtrooms into personal meeting centers? Martin stood up. He could not remain silent. May I say something, Your Honor? The judge looked at him skeptically but nodded. Speak. Martin took a deep breath. I don't want to change the system, nor am I seeking benefits. What I ask for has no cost. Just 15 minutes. 15 minutes to look him in the eyes and say thank you. He doesn't understand procedures or civil codes. He only understands that one day he stopped seeing me, and he doesn't know why. The silence was absolute. Even the prosecutor seemed disarmed for a second, but he immediately recovered his usual tone. Your Honor, I insist. We cannot legislate based on emotions. The judge said nothing. Her fingers drummed slowly on the wood. She seemed to be debating between logic and something that perhaps she herself did not understand. It was then that Elena stood up and handed an envelope to the court clerk. With your permission, Judge, we present as evidence a psychological report of Mr. Salcedo issued by his primary therapist. It details the importance of Rocco as a post-traumatic stabilizing factor. The judge flipped through the papers without apparent expression, but Martin noticed a slight tremor in her fingers as she turned the last page. For the first time, something seemed to have penetrated the armor. Very well, she said at last. I accept the report, and we will take a 20-minute recess before continuing. Martin sat back down. His body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from an anxiety that had accumulated for years. The fight had just begun, and the enemy this time was neither visible nor tangible. It had no face or flag. It was a cold, mechanical system, and deeply disconnected from the human. But if he had learned anything on the battlefield, it was that no wall is impenetrable if the heart knows why it fights. Martin remained seated, staring at the white marble floor. The murmur of the room had disappeared. Only the echo of the past resonated in his mind. The recess was a pause in time, but inside him, memories returned like a storm. Elena, beside him, said nothing. She knew that these battles were not fought with words but with shared silences. He remembered the return, the first day back home after years deployed. The apartment was intact, as if time had stopped. Except for him. The white walls seemed too clean, too foreign. Everything he loved had changed or was gone. His wife didn't wait for him. His son barely spoke to him. And at night, the shadows returned. But Rocco was there. The army allowed him to keep the dog temporarily during his reintegration process. He was his only light in the darkness. When panic attacks knocked him to the ground, it was Rocco who woke him up. When he couldn't sleep, it was his constant breathing that kept him anchored. When he thought about ending it all, it was Rocco's eyes, attentive and faithful, that made him stay. And yet, after 2 years, a letter sealed his fate. Rocco had to be handed over. The state required his relocation for another service. "Why didn't you fight before?" Elena had asked him weeks ago. "Because I thought I couldn't win, but now it's not about winning anymore. It's about not staying silent." The recess ended. The judge returned to the bench with the same impenetrable face. Elena handed her another document. "This is an additional testimony from Dr. Zulema Barreto, a clinical psychologist and specialist in veteran mental health. She has worked with Mr. Salcedo for the past 4 years." The judge nodded without looking up. "Proceed." The document was read by the court clerk. Each word was like a small crack in the emotional wall of the room. "Mr. Martin Salcedo presents symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, including episodic dissociation, chronic insomnia, and severe anxiety. During the period of therapy, a significant improvement in his clinical pictures has been documented thanks to the continued interaction with the dog Rocco. His separation has triggered an emotional regression that puts his recovery at risk." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but did not interrupt. For the first time, he did not have a counter-argument that did not sound inhumane. Martin took a deep breath. There was something in the atmosphere that was beginning to change, as if the doctor's words had cracked the cold surface of the trial. "Your Honor," Elena said then, "we are not asking to alter the laws. We are only asking to consider humanity within the legal framework." The judge looked up for a moment. Her eyes showed no emotion, but Martin felt that, for the first time, she saw him for real. "What would you propose then?" she asked. "A visit," Elena replied. "Just one. Under supervision, in controlled conditions, 0 cost to the state, just a dignified farewell." The judge did not respond immediately. Then she looked at the clock on the wall. "The court will continue tomorrow at 9. I will review all the material presented and give a preliminary resolution." Martin felt he could breathe again. It was not a victory, but it was not a slam of the door either. It was a glimmer of possibility. When they left the court, the sun was already beginning to set. The city continued its course, oblivious to the silent drama that was taking place within those walls. "Are you okay?" Eleanor asked. Martin nodded, but his eyes said otherwise. "I don't know. I just know that for the first time in years, I feel that my story matters." And with that thought, they crossed the street in silence, knowing that the next day would bring new answers, or new wounds. The next morning dawned grey, with a drizzle that slowly soaked the city. Martin arrived early at the courthouse even before the doors opened. He walked in circles on the sidewalk, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the wet ground. The weather seemed a reflection of his mood, heavy, uncertain, but determined. When Eleanor arrived, he barely looked up. She smiled softly at him and offered him a hot coffee. "Today could be the day," she said. Martin did not respond. He only nodded, like someone clinging to an invisible thread of hope. At 9 o'clock sharp, the hearing resumed. Judge Ramirez entered with the same rigid bearing, but something in her way of walking was different, perhaps slower, more thoughtful. Maybe it was just an illusion. Maybe not. After reviewing the documentation delivered, she began, the court recognizes the emotional value of the bond between Mr. Salcedo and the animal in question. However, it must also consider the legal precedent that this case represents. The prosecutor, Gutierrez, always alert, straightened up in his seat like someone anticipating a move in his favor. In view of this, the judge continued, more substantiation is required to assess whether an exception can be contemplated without violating the current legal framework. Elena frowned. What exactly does that mean, Your Honor? It means that I need more than emotional testimonies. I need jurisprudence, concrete antecedents, legal arguments that support this petition. Martin felt a pang in his stomach. He knew that the system was not moved by tears, but by codes, laws, and precedents. With all due respect, Your Honor, he intervened, is there no place in the law for compassion? The judge looked at him harshly. Compassion isn't codified, Mr. Salcedo. Justice is based on the rule of law, not on affection. That blow was harder than any direct rejection, but it wasn't time to give up. Eleanor asked for permission to present an additional argument. We've located a previous case, she said, that of an infantry veteran who, in 2015, received authorization to adopt his service dog after a favorable court order. It wasn't a farewell, but it laid a foundation. The judge took the document and read it in silence. Her face didn't change. The prosecutor intervened immediately. For that case was in another jurisdiction. It's not binding here. Furthermore, it was an exception motivated by medical reasons certified by the Army. And this case is too, Elena replied firmly. Dr. Barreto is a certified specialist. The report we presented yesterday is clear. Gutierrez clicked his tongue. Emotions disguised as diagnoses. We can all seem broken if we look hard enough. Martin felt his blood boil. He stood up without asking permission. Do you think this is an act? His voice was low but firm. Do you think it's easy to come here and beg for something that should be human? Rocco isn't an anecdote or a whim. He's my partner, my shield, my sanity. The judge gently struck the gavel. Order in the court. Martin sat back down without taking his eyes off the prosecutor. All I ask is that you see him as what he is, not as a number in an inventory. There was silence for a few seconds. Then the judge took a deep breath. The court will make a final decision this afternoon. Until then, I suspend the hearing. When they left the courthouse, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast. Martin walked slowly to the nearest park bench and slumped down. I feel like I'm talking to a wall. Elena sat down beside him. Sometimes even walls listen. You just have to insist enough. Martin smiled faintly. Not because he believed she was right, but because he needed to believe it. And as the wind swept the fallen leaves at their feet, he knew that the worst was yet to come. The courtroom was almost empty when they returned in the afternoon. Most of the morning's attendees hadn't returned, as if they sensed that the case had stalled. But Martin knew that important decisions were almost always made in the final stretch. The judge entered with her firm and neutral gait. The prosecutor, Gutierrez, reviewed his papers with an impassive expression. Elena glanced sideways at Martin, looking for some sign of hope on his face. He remained calm, but his breathing was heavier than usual. Mr. Salcedo, the judge said without preamble, the court has considered your arguments. However, there are still missing elements. I would like to hear an outside perspective that doesn't come from your defense or your medical reports. Martin and Elena looked at each other confused. It was then that the door at the back opened and a tall man entered, with a weathered face and gray hair cropped in a military style. He was wearing a suit, but his posture betrayed years in the service. Who is he? Martin whispered. Colonel Victor Alarcon, Elena replied. We located him this morning. He served with you in the same unit. Martin was speechless. He hadn't seen him in almost a decade. The colonel presented himself before the stand with a grave but respectful voice. The judge asked him to state what he knew about the bond between Martin and Rocco. Your Honor, Alarcon began, I was there when this man and that dog met, and I was also there when he saved us all. If I'm alive today, it's partly thanks to Rocco. And thanks to Martin knowing how to listen to him. He described an ambush in which the platoon was surprised by snipers. Rocco detected the movement before any drone or radar. His precise bark alerted the unit just in time. The subsequent evasion maneuver saved 5 lives. That animal, the colonel continued, isn't just a trained dog. He has a deep bond with Martin. I've seen it in action. They were never separated, and when we returned, I myself recommended that they be able to be together during their civilian reintegration. The judge listened in silence. Not once did she interrupt. And do you consider, Colonel, that this bond justifies a judicial exception? Yes, Your Honor, and not as a soldier, but as a human being. I beg you not to take away from Mr. Salcedo the possibility of closing that bond with dignity. An emotional murmur ran through the room, but the prosecutor's response was immediate. With all due respect to the witness, Gutierrez intervened, it's not being debated here whether Mr. Salcedo is brave or whether the dog is loyal. The point is that Rocco has already been reassigned to another soldier, and that changes everything. Martin slowly turned his head. What did he say? The prosecutor took a document from his folder. The animal was delivered this week to a new member of the K9 unit. The process is already complete. There's no legal way to undo it. It was like a bomb falling in the room. Elena opened her eyes in shock. The colonel lowered his gaze. And Martin. Martin went blank. The judge confirmed with her secretary. The information was true. Why wasn't this reported before? Elena asked, containing her anger. Because it wasn't relevant until a possible delivery of the animal was discussed. Since that wasn't on the table, it wasn't necessary to mention it. Martin felt something inside him break. It wasn't just sadness, it was a mixture of betrayal and emptiness. He hadn't even had the opportunity to prepare for that news. Elena took his hand tightly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The system had already decided, in silence, without a hearing, without a face. The judge called for order and concluded the day's session. The final ruling will be given tomorrow, she said. And no further testimony will be accepted. Martin left the court without saying a word. In his chest something burned. It wasn't rage, it was pain. A pain that only those who have lost something irreplaceable can understand. That night, Martin didn't sleep. He walked around the small borrowed apartment where he was staying, pacing in the dark like a caged animal. Elena had offered to stay, but he had preferred to be alone. Not because he didn't need company, but because he no longer knew how to bear the weight of so much shared silence. Sitting on the edge of the bed with his elbows resting on his knees, he held between his hands an old wrinkled photo. Him, Rocco, and his squad smiling after a completed mission. The image seemed from another world. One that no longer existed. The news of the reassignment had crushed him. The entire trial, all the efforts, the testimonies, the words measured with precision. For what? The system had run its course, without waiting for anyone to raise their voice. The next morning, Elena arrived early. She entered without speaking, as if words hindered more than they helped. She left a cup of coffee on the table and sat down in front of him. "Are you sure you want to go?" she asked softly. Martin nodded. "I'm not doing it for me anymore. I'm doing it for him." On the way to the courthouse, the city seemed to have not changed. The traffic, the honking, the people checking their phones. No one knew what was happening between those grey walls, what that trial meant for a man who had already lost almost everything. Upon entering the room, he noticed that there were more people than the day before. Rumors of the case had begun to circulate. Some new faces looked with curiosity, others with empathy, but Martin didn't see them. His gaze was fixed on the stand, on the figure of the judge, on the wall clock that marked each second like a hammer on his back. The judge took her seat. Gutierrez, as always, impeccable and serene, leafed through his folder as if he already knew the result. Elena remained standing with a tense face, her hands clasped together, but before the hearing began, Martin stood up. "Your Honor, I know it's not in the protocol, but I asked for permission to say something." The judge observed him, surprised by the interruption. She hesitated for a moment. "You have 2 minutes," she granted. Martine took a step forward. The room held its breath. "I didn't ask for this trial on a whim," he said, "nor out of pride. I asked for it because I didn't know what else to do. I asked for it because I'm losing myself. When I returned from service, I didn't recognize anything. Not my home, not my family, not my own face in the mirror. I felt like my life was over. Until he appeared." His voice began to break. "Rocco wasn't just my dog. He was my therapist, my friend, my only constant. When I woke up drenched in sweat from nightmares, he was there. When my mind took me back to the desert, his breathing brought me back. And now, they've taken him away from me without even being able to say goodbye." The judge kept her gaze fixed on him. Gutierrez watched him, uncomfortable. The audience didn't move. "I don't want to challenge your authority," he continued. "I just want you to know that behind every paper, every law, every article of the code, there's a life, a story, a human being trying not to break completely." A dense silence took over the room. Martine returned to his seat. Elena took his hand, this time with more force than ever. The judge said nothing for several seconds. Then she asked the secretary to hand her a file. She reviewed it, turning page after page with a harsh but different gesture, as if something inside her was beginning to falter. "The court will take a 30-minute recess before issuing its decision," she finally announced. Martine closed his eyes. He didn't expect miracles, but he did need that break, because what he had left in that room wasn't just a testimony. It was his soul, whole and unreserved. And at that moment, for the first time in a long time, he understood that he couldn't continue fighting alone. The recess became an eternity. Martine didn't move from his seat. He looked ahead, seeing nothing, as if his body were there, but his mind floated in some distant corner, trapped between memory and pain. Elena went out for a few minutes, spoke to someone in the hallway, and returned with a folder in her hand. She sat down beside him, but waited a moment before speaking. "We have something," she whispered. Martine slowly turned his head. "What thing?" "A report from a foundation that works with assistance dogs for veterans. They found out about the case. They want to deliver a formal proposal to intervene in situations like yours. It doesn't change today's outcome, but it could open doors." Martine looked at her in silence. There was weariness in his eyes, but also something else. A spark, weak but persistent. "Do you think it will work?" "If it doesn't work for you, it will work for others." The judge returned to the room exactly 31 minutes later. She sat down without haste, leafed through a few more papers, and then addressed the audience in a solemn tone. "Before issuing the final ruling, I will allow the defense to present the additional documentation." Elena stood up and handed over the folder. "This is a pilot program for post-war emotional support. The Sister Souls Foundation proposes to work with the Ministry of Defense to avoid situations like that of Mr. Salcedo. It includes a supervised farewell protocol without budgetary impact." The judge read in silence, without showing any reaction. Then she looked at Martine. "Would you participate in that program?" Martine nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor. I would do it without thinking." The judge put the report in her folder and leaned back in her chair. She seemed to be debating something that wasn't written in the codes. "Very well," she said at last. "In that case, before giving the ruling, I will allow Mr. Salcedo to read the letter he requested to present yesterday." Martine's heart jumped. With trembling hands, he took a folded paper from his pocket. It was an old sheet, handwritten, with some coffee stains and wrinkled edges. He stood up, looked at the room, and began to read. "Dear Rocco, I don't know if you'll ever understand why I stopped looking for you, if you know how much it hurt me to leave you. There are nights when I swear I hear your footsteps in the hallway, or I feel your breath near when fear wakes me up. You were more than a companion. You were my lifeline in a dark sea. I owe you my life, my sanity, and those small moments of peace that I still remember. Forgive me for not having fought before. Forgive me for not knowing how to face a world without you. If I could see you one more time, just one, I would say thank you for everything, for never failing me, for being my home when I no longer had one. I love you. Forever. Martine. The silence that followed was absolute. No prosecutor spoke. No judge interrupted. Not even the clock seemed to dare to mark the time. A man from the audience stood up. He was young, thin, in military uniform. He walked slowly towards the center of the room until he was a few steps from the stand. In his hands, he carried an identification folder. "Excuse me," he said in an insecure voice. "I'm Rocco's new assignee." The judge observed him with surprise. Elena turned quickly. Martine could barely breathe. "I heard the whole hearing," the soldier continued. "And if you allow me, I want to give up my assignment. I didn't know the dog had a story like that. I can't stay with him knowing what he means to this man." There was a murmur. Martine felt a lump in his throat so strong that he couldn't speak. The judge took a deep breath. For the first time, her voice trembled slightly. "This changes the conditions of the case. If the current assignee signs the resignation and both parties agree, the court can reconsider the ruling." The young man nodded. Martine lowered his head, overcome by emotion. For the first time in a long time, he felt that fate was offering him a second chance. The silence that followed the young soldier's offer was long and reverent, as if no one in the room wanted to break the moment. Even the prosecutor Gutierrez remained in his seat, with his hands crossed on the table and his gaze lowered. For the first time since the beginning of the trial, there were no objections, no technicalities, no predictable phrases. Just a human gesture, an act of empathy. The judge asked the soldier to approach the stand. He handed over his folder and a document with his signature, where he formally renounced the assignment of the dog Rocco. Everything was done in a matter of minutes, but for Martine, it was as if the whole world had stopped. "Are you sure about this, soldier?" asked the judge, maintaining her composure. "Yes, Your Honor. I think Rocco has already fulfilled his duty to me, without even having started." "And his true place is with him," he said, looking at Martine. The judge nodded slowly, then looked at the prosecutor. "Any objections?" Gutierrez took a deep breath. He had every right to appeal, to entangle the process with technicalities, to impose the cold structure of the law once again. But something in his face had changed. Maybe it was the letter, or the silent firmness with which Martine had defended his cause. "No, Your Honor," he replied without looking at anyone. Martine felt his legs tremble. Elena held his arm so he wouldn't lose his balance. The judge spoke again. "Very well. This court, based on the voluntary resignation of the new assignee, the documentation presented, and the exceptional nature of the case, authorizes a farewell hearing between Mr. Salcedo and the animal Rocco, under judicial supervision and in a controlled environment." A wave of relief swept through the room. It wasn't an adoption nor a permanent handover, but it was what Martine had asked for from the beginning, a dignified farewell. The judge then paused for a moment. She looked at Martine intently. Something in her gaze, almost imperceptible, had changed. "Mr. Salcedo, this decision does not set a precedent. It doesn't create a legal basis for future similar cases, but it does leave a mark. And I thank you for reminding us that the law, although blind, must not be deaf." Martine couldn't answer. He just nodded, his eyes full of tears. Elena smiled, moved. Colonel Alarcon, who had discreetly returned to see the end, let out a sigh that had been held in for years. The date of the farewell was set for the next day. It would be a brief ceremony at the courthouse, with the presence of the press, members of the military, and representatives of the Sister Souls Foundation. A symbolic way to close the cycle and open a new one. In the hallways of the courthouse, the news spread quickly. Some applauded timidly, others just watched in silence with respect. Martine went outside, the afternoon light hitting his face. He took a deep breath as if he had just emerged from a deep well. Elena stopped beside him. "You did it." "Not just me," he replied. "It was you. It was Alarcon. It was that kid. And it was Rocco. It was always him." She laughed softly. "You know what my grandmother once told me?" "What?" that dogs know when a story isn't over. And that's why they always find their way back. Martin looked down. He thought about the years shared, the sleepless nights, the silent walks with the dog by his side, about the times he wanted to give up and the times he couldn't because Rocco was there. He looked up at the sky, which had finally cleared. Tomorrow he would see him. Not as a goodbye, he thought, but as a see you later. The day had arrived. Martin dressed in his uniform once more. He smoothed it with careful hands, as if each fold spoke of a past that still hurt. It wasn't vanity, it was respect. Not for the courthouse, nor for the press that awaited him, but for Rocco. He wanted him to see him standing, whole like the man he once was. Elena was waiting for him at the entrance of the courthouse. She was carrying a folder in her hands, but she didn't say a word. Her eyes were enough. They were full of pride and a silent affection, forged in every moment of shared struggle. The ceremony would be held in a side room of the courthouse, specially equipped for the meeting. A large space with high windows and chairs arranged in a semicircle. Present were members of the foundation, court officials, some discreet reporters, and the young soldier who had given up his place. He was in a corner, standing, with his hands crossed and his gaze attentive. Martin remained in the center of the room, with his back to the door through which Rocco would enter. His heart was beating like a war drum. He didn't know what to feel. He was afraid. What if Rocco didn't recognize him? What if time had separated them too much? Then the door opened. No one needed to announce anything. Martin knew it immediately. He felt the air move, the silence fill with a familiar presence. He turned slowly, and there he was. Rocco advanced with a firm but calm step. He was wearing a black harness and was being guided by a military handler. His eyes, those eyes that Martin knew better than his own, fixed on him. 2 seconds were enough. The dog pulled on the leash with a short, hoarse bark, and the handler released it without resistance. Rocco ran towards Martin with a mixture of force and urgency that disarmed everyone in the room. Martin fell to his knees instantly with his arms open. Rocco lunged at him, gently nudging him with his snout, sniffing him, whimpering with contained emotion. He circled him, licked his hands, rested his head on his chest, as if to make sure it was real. "Hello, friend," Martin whispered, his voice breaking. "Hello, my brave one." Those present watched in silence, many with tears in their eyes. The judge standing at the back did not try to intervene. She knew that this moment did not belong to the court. Martin hugged Rocco tightly. Time seemed to stop. The world outside that moment didn't exist. "Forgive me for leaving you," he said in his ear, as if the dog could understand every word. "It wasn't my choice. I looked for you with every memory, every night, every dream." Rocco lay down next to him, pressing his back against his leg as he had years ago, in the makeshift camps in the desert, when danger was meters away and silence said it all. The young soldier approached respectfully and left an object wrapped in cloth on the floor. Rocco's old training ball. Martin took it, showed it to him, and the dog barked twice, wagging his tail as if youth had returned. "Feu still remembers," Martin said, and smiled for the first time in a long time. The cameras were recording, but no one was doing it out of morbid curiosity. They were doing it because they knew that these kinds of moments were rare, because in the middle of a world of harsh laws and cold news, something real was happening there, a reunion, a farewell, or maybe something more. After several minutes, the handler approached. It was time to finish. Martin stood up, petted Rocco on the head one last time, and looked him in the eyes. "No matter where you are, Rocco, you'll always be my partner. Always." The dog watched him without moving, as if understanding every syllable. Then obediently he followed the handler to the exit. And Martin stayed there in the middle of the room, with his arms hanging at his sides and his heart trembling, feeling that he had just closed something. Or at least, that's what he thought. Martin remained standing, motionless. The room began to slowly disperse, as if the act had already concluded. Some attendees murmured words of consolation. Others approached Elena to congratulate her on her perseverance. But he didn't hear anything. His gaze remained fixed on the door through which Rocco had just left. He felt that something inside him had been torn away with an unbearable tenderness. That farewell that he had longed for so much, so full of meaning, had left him empty. He had closed a chapter, yes, but he had also lost his only companion, this time definitively. Elena approached slowly with a faint smile. "It was beautiful, Martin. He knew it. You felt it, didn't you?" Martin nodded slowly, but his eyes were still full of moisture. "Yes, but that doesn't make it any easier." He was going to say something else when a general murmur forced him to look towards the entrance. The young soldier, the one who had given up Rocco's assignment, was now talking to Judge Ramirez. His gestures were intense, although respectful. He seemed to be requesting something firmly. Martin frowned. Elena turned to observe. "What's going on now?" Before they could guess, the judge raised a hand, asking for silence. She walked calmly to the center of the room. This time, without papers in her hand, without a file, only her in flesh and blood, facing something that wasn't in the protocol. "Mr. Salcedo," she said in a clear voice, "this court has already fulfilled its function. A farewell was authorized under exceptional conditions. The procedure in legal terms has concluded." Martin nodded silently. He knew what was coming, the final closure. The official goodbye, the inevitable acceptance. But the judge didn't stop there. "However," she continued, "the young soldier who was present has requested, of his own free will and under written declaration, the complete and definitive transfer of the rights over Rocco in your favor. He not only renounces the assignment, but insists on giving it to you as an act of conscience." Martin didn't understand at first. It took a second, two, and then his body took a step forward as if his heart was pushing him. "What did you say?" The soldier approached, now with Rocco by his side, without a leash. The dog walked loose, but calm. He stopped in front of Martin and sat down, upright, expectant. "He's yours, sir," said the young man. "I couldn't live with that dog knowing what he means to you. You raised him, you saved him, you loved him. I couldn't look at him without feeling like a thief." Martin didn't know what to do. He took a step back, as if the ground was opening up beneath his feet. "Is this legal?" he asked, almost without a voice. The judge replied, this time with a different expression. She wasn't smiling, but there was a contained tenderness on her face. "Legal. It's not entirely, but morally this court has no objection. If both parties agree and the Foundation assumes the monitoring of the case, we will not intervene." Martin fell to his knees once more. Rocco, as in a perfect reflection, approached and rested his head on his chest. There was no need for words. The dog knew it immediately. This time it wasn't a visit. This time it was forever. The applause began without anyone ordering it. Soft first, then louder. Not for the legal victory, but for what had just happened. An act of justice born of the heart, not of the code. Elena was crying openly. Colonel Alarcon was applauding with shining eyes. Even Gutierrez, the prosecutor, tilted his head slightly in a gesture of respect. Martin stood up with Rocco by his side. He turned to the young soldier, extended his hand, but he hugged him without hesitation. "Thank you," Martin said, his voice breaking. "You gave me back my life." "He was the one who kept it safe all this time," replied the boy. "I just gave it back to you." And so, amidst tears, hugs, and soft barks, the story found its true ending. Not one dictated by the law, but by something much more powerful: compassion. The courtroom slowly emptied. The applause ceased, the cameras went off, and the murmurs turned into respectful silence. But in the hearts of all those present, something had changed. It was not a court ruling that was celebrated that day, but a victory of the soul over indifference. Martin left the building with Rocco walking by his side, without a leash, but obedient, as always, as if time hadn't passed, as if life, suddenly, had decided to give back what one day it took away without warning. Days later, both began working with the Sister Souls Foundation, collaborating with emotional support programs for veterans. Martin wasn't looking for fame or recognition. He just wanted to make sure that no other soldier had to beg to say goodbye to a friend. Judge Ramirez, for her part, requested an internal review of the reassignment protocols for service dogs. She didn't give speeches or interviews. But those who knew her knew that this case had left a mark that no code could erase. Today, when Martin walks through the park and someone asks him about Rocco, he simply smiles and replies, "He's more than a dog. He's my miracle on paws." This story is not about laws, it's about what happens when we decide to listen to the heart above the rules. And if you also believe that love and loyalty can change the world, don't let this story be lost. Share this video, leave your comment, and subscribe for more real stories that remind us that there is still humanity in the world. Because sometimes goodbyes are not the end. Sometimes they are the beginning of something even bigger.